Welcome to all of us today. Thank you for joining us for a conversation with Ed Davey, leader of the Liberal Democrats. While we regularly attend conference, this is the Board of Deputies' first ever event at the Liberal Democrat Conference, and we could hardly have got off to a better start than hosting the new leader. So many thanks. We are delighted to be partnering with Liberal Democrat Friends of Israel, who run fantastic events at conference every year. I would like to thank Ed for taking the time to join us today. And I'd like also to thank the President of the Liberal Democrats, Mark Pack, for helping to ensure that this event could go ahead. A couple of months ago, Mark was in touch with us, having already consulted with our friends at Liberal Democrat Friends of Israel, after it was realised when exactly the party conference was due to take place. As politically minded members of our community will no doubt be aware, party conference season almost always falls around the time of the high holidays, and this time of year, the final day of the Liberal Democrat Conference, traditionally when the leader gives their speech, falls on Yom Kippur, the holiest day of the year in Judaism. With that realization and understanding that most Jews will not be able to listen to Ed's speech live, the Liberal Democrats were keen to ensure that the Jewish community would have the opportunity to hear from Ed, which brings us to today's event. The concerns of the UK's Jewish community mirror the concerns of society at large. I would encourage people to take a look at our Jewish manifesto available on our website, which focuses on a wide range of issues, including health and social care, housing, welfare, and of course, the impact of Brexit. But there are also issues of particular concern to the Jewish community, combating anti-Semitism, for example. The Liberal Democrats have their own challenges in this regard. We are glad that Jenny Tong and David Ward, for example, have, in the past few years, been clearly and emphatically shown the door by the party. And we are encouraged by the party's rapid response to recent revelations about a potential London mayoral candidate. So thank you. Both in and outside and beyond politics, an increasing amount of anti-Semitism is now taking place online. And I'm sure today we will have discussion as to how this should be combated. Similarly, religious freedom issues with regard to Jewish schooling, religious slaughter and circumcision are one which the community watches closely. And for the overwhelming majority, Israel is an issue of key importance. I am sure we will all look forward to hearing what Ed has to say on these issues, as well as many others. We will now hear from Ed directly, after which he will then be in conversation with Gavin Stollar, the Honorary Chair of LDFI. Finally, for all those observing Yom Kippur, which starts this evening, this will of course not be like any other Yom Kippur we have experienced in our lifetimes. I want to wish you all an easy but meaningful fast. May this year bring a resolution to the current crises, which has had such a devastating impact upon the world. Thank you, and over to you, Ed.
Thank you, Marie. And I really want to thank the Board of Deputies for attending our online conference and giving me a chance to talk to you all. And of course, my friends in the Liberal Democrat Friends of Israel too for facilitating today. And I want to wish everyone a really happy Yom Kippur. It's very difficult when we're celebrating our religious festivals during COVID. And I know how everyone is wants to be with their families and how tricky it has been. So my heart goes out to you. I hope you do managed to celebrate it in all the ways that we're now finding to do so in this rather worrying time. But if I may start by introducing myself a little bit and talking about the challenges I see for the Liberal Democrats, and then talking about some of the issues affecting the Jewish community. Hopefully many of you will know me because I've been around a little while. I've been an MP since 1997 with a 2-year sabbatical. And I've got a wonderful Jewish community in my constituency. And I'm engaged with LDFI over many, many years with Lord Monroe Palmer, Gavin Stollar, Toby, and others. And we've had a really, really constructive dialogue, and I want to thank them all for that. So hopefully I'm not completely new to you. I want to say a little bit about myself in the context of where I want to take the Liberal Democrats. And the context, first of all, for that is that Liberal Democrats haven't been doing very well, I'm afraid. You may have not, I'm sure you've noticed, we've had 3 disappointing general elections in 5 years. And one's got to recognize that things have been going wrong. So when I became the acting leader, I instituted a general election review, which looked not just at what happened in 2019, which obviously was completely full of the Brexit debate, but it went back to the 2017 election, 2015 election, and how the party has been engaging with people across the country. And we published it. It doesn't pull any punches. And it shows that we need to make ourselves more relevant to people across Britain. And we need to make sure that we're not just thinking about our inward concerns, but we're looking outwards and we're engaging with people about where they are. Because political parties are really relevant to people's concerns and problems and their hopes and their dreams. So to start that process, is all right saying it, what you're going to do about it. I'm making sure that the party just reflects, takes some time, got a little bit of time. And I'm personally going on what I'm calling a listening tour. So I'm going outside of Westminster over months and months and months, way in, probably this time next year, I'll still be doing it. Going to talk to people in their communities, in their workplaces, no cameras, no microphones, just talking to people to listen to their concerns. So we're really clear. I've done 3 of these visits so far to the northwest of Stockport, where I did a lunchtime shift in a fish and chip shop. I've been to see some businesses in Cardiff, some farms in Mid Wales. I've been to a green tourism business in Fife, and I'm coming to a place near you soon. And the idea is that we need to really engage and understand what people's top priorities are. And you won't be surprised that it's around COVID. It's around jobs and businesses and livelihoods. People want to know what we're going to do about that, as well as how we can try and persuade the government to get a greater grip on this pandemic. So those are the concerns that I'm already hearing back from people, and you won't be surprised about those. And I want to add to this listening tour, I want to listen to all communities, including, of course, the Jewish community. I like to feel we've got a good relationship, as I said before, but I want that listening tour that I and the party are doing is to really engage with the Jewish community. And through the good offices of Monroe and Gavin and the Liberal Democrat Friends for Israel, I'm sure we can make that happen. And I see today as a start of that, absolutely not the end of it. So I'm looking forward to further discussions with the board, with and others, leaders in the Jewish community in our country. So thank you for giving me this opportunity. Let me just briefly touch on other issues. That first of all, anti-Semitism. I think it's been absolutely tragic that this issue has come to the fore in our country. Like many of you, I just thought we got past this appalling hatred and prejudice. But maybe I was naive, maybe you understood that it was always there beneath the surface. But the fact that it has had a potency in our country, I think, is one of the most shocking things I've seen in my political career. And I can say that on behalf of the Liberal Democrats, and absolutely under my leadership, we will be a force working with you to eradicate anti-Semitism from our country. It must absolutely play no part in our politics. We've made real strides in our party. We've followed your advice. We've had the recent thing, the first test in my leadership. I found that the vetting processes of one of our mayoral candidates had really, frankly, been not up to scratch, and we've got to put that right. Very late in the day, after this candidate had been put on the shortlist, we were shown video of her making anti-Semitic remarks a few years ago, and it was some of the worst anti-Semitic remarks I've seen. And we were absolutely clear we need to deal with it, and we dealt with it within hours. And I want to pay tribute to Mark Pack, the president of the party, to Gavin Stollar, who gave us good advice, and we did move and act quickly, and we will act quickly. There can be no debate about that. And I want to talk to you, and hopefully you will ask me questions about how we can work together to be even stronger on rooting out anti-Semitism in our society, in our world. And then, of course, there's the issues around Israel, often very much understood in the UK. People forget some of the amazing achievements and contributions to the world that Israel makes, and we need to recognise those. And of course, there'll be issues around Palestine and the occupied territories. There'll be issues around the wider Middle East, which is a very difficult place at the moment. Whether you're thinking about what's happened in Lebanon and the instability in that country on the borders of Israel, of course, of Syria. I always think you need to take good advice before you pronounce on these issues. And we've got lots of people in LDFI who can advise us, and I'm hoping others will too. Layla Moran is our new Foreign Affairs and International Development spokesperson. She does know a lot about this. She is half Palestinian, but I think anyone who's spoken to her knows that she's very thoughtful, well considered, and very balanced on this issue. And I know she'll want to work with you as we work for peace and justice, and for really deep understanding of the situation, rather than one where people come to it with prejudice, which is just not acceptable. So lots to talk about. I'll keep quiet now so you can ask me questions, but I'm looking forward not just to today, but to many other discussions, so our relationship can go from strength to strength. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Ed, and it's great to see you. I think we all wish we were together in any of the aforementioned seaside towns that we frequent once a year, not least because of the economic benefit that gives to those places. So here's looking forward to, as we say in the Jewish faith, next year in Jerusalem, but in the context of conference next year in Bournemouth. Let's hope that comes true. Ed, you are familiar to many of the Lib Dem members and supporters who will be on this webinar. I should just let you know that we're as you're aware, we're broadcasting live across the globe. We're going through the Jewish Chronicle, the Jewish Telegraph, the Board of Deputies, the Jewish News, Liberal Judaism, LDFI, all of those channels. So hopefully we're reaching a far and wide audience. And this
Gavin, does that mean I'm going to be famous at last?
We can only hope. We can only hope. But all this tech slightly beyond me, but I'm delighted that everyone's been able to bring this together. And testament to both you and Layla, because during the leadership election, both of you agreed to honour this commitment, working with the board, and we were delighted to help facilitate this as well. For those that don't know, Ed is a great friend of the UK Jewish community. He's someone who has been a stalwart friend of our community. He's also a good and solid friend of Israel. Like all good friends, he helps to magnify where the country's doing well, and also flag up where he thinks it needs and must do better. And we should always recognise our friends. In the context of the leadership election that's just come and gone, Lib Dem Friends of Israel submitted a series of questions to both leadership candidates, and we were delighted both Ed and Layla came back. And in some senses, having Ed as leader now and Layla as our foreign affairs spokesman, certainly in the context of the Middle East, it's almost a dream team from our perspective, because as you say, Layla has so much to offer in this space, certainly in the international affairs arena. I'm taken back to last Yom Kippur, actually sitting in synagogue in Marble Arch, where we are lucky to be treated to the emeritus Chief Rabbi Jonathan Sachs joining us each year, and he actually stood on the pulpit in the midst. This is obviously in the midst of all of the Labour anti-Semitism crisis, and he shared with the whole congregation about how he'd watched an MP, a young MP of Palestinian descent, calling out Jeremy Corbyn for what he was, which was anti-Semitic, and he said that young and very bright MP was a hope to us all. What I was kicking myself slightly that he didn't mention it was Layla Moran, who was a Liberal Democrat MP. Mm-hmm. So afterwards, I reminded, or I pointed that out to him, and he was obviously very grateful. So the idea that we have a friend of Israel in the context of our foreign affairs brief, and a friend of Israel in the context of you, Ed, in the leadership, should give us all great strength and comfort. Just drawing all of that together in terms of the Q&A, what we're going to try and do today is just explore some of those answers you gave previously on some of those issues, because the issues stay extant. And it's a great opportunity to just go through some of those issues. Just starting, if we can, with the significant rise in anti-Semitism over the last 5 years, and it's been no more evident than what we've seen in the Labour Party, and more recently the tirade by grime artist Wiley on Twitter and Instagram, which resulted in the hashtag No Space for Jew Hate Twitter walkout, which you were part of, for which we're very grateful. And I should say that wasn't because LDFI or any of the Jewish communal organisations asked you. That was clearly an issue of conscience for you. I just wanted to ask you, why do you think there's been a real resurgence in anti-Semitism in recent times, or did it in fact never go away? And in addition, how do you think we should as a community and as a political establishment seek to combat it on an ongoing basis?
It's a very good question about what's been the cause of the rise. I think you've seen it across the world. That's the real scary aspect of it, because it's not just in the UK. There may be different countries, of course, but what is, I think, most worrying to people is that you've seen it in country after country. And I think that's why we need to work, obviously, within the UK, very strongly across party and outside political parties, particularly with yourselves. But I think we need to work internationally as well. And I think people probably on the Board of Deputies can tell me the best answer to this question, because I'd like to be educated, if you don't mind. You may have much better insights than I do. All I can say is we should be utterly committed to working together to stamp it out, to eradicate it. And that may be difficult, but we've just got to keep at it. I mean, the thing that always brings it home to me is when I've worked with groups like the Holocaust Education Trust, and you see what happens when people are prejudiced and discriminate against people by their religion or anything else, frankly. And I've visited some of the concentration camps, and if you go away from that with anything other than a determination to stamp out not just genocide but hatred, I don't see how you can be human. And I've been touched by so many testaments of Jewish people, not just about the Holocaust, but also about other examples of appalling anti-Semitism. And it's a challenge to us. We've just got to rise to that challenge and recognize that it's our duty. It's absolutely our duty. I would say, as liberals, but actually anybody, matter your political philosophy, to work with the community for security and safety and prevent prejudice.
You touched on there, that's really helpful, Ed. I mean, you touched on their Holocaust Educational Trust, who, again, the Lib Democrat Party has been great supporters of. Many of our MPs, candidates and former MPs and peers have been out with Karen Pollock and her team to the Lessons from Auschwitz course, which does amazing work taking students from all over the country out to learn about what happened in those terrible dark times. This year marked the 75th year since liberation of Auschwitz. However, The Guardian alarmingly reported that two-thirds of young Americans did not know that 6 million Jews died in the Holocaust. Do you think we as a party and politicians in general have a greater responsibility to help educate and teach about the horrors of the Holocaust? And if so, how do you think we as a party or a country should and could go about it? Does it start with people like you going on those trips and talking about them in Parliament? How can we evangelize that message?
We absolutely have to show leadership on it. When I went on the trip to Auschwitz, it was with a school. And what's amazing about the Holocaust Education Trust is it provides some amazing materials for schools up and down our country, and I guess in other countries too, so that the teachers and families can really ensure that our young people are engaged with it in a way which is accessible, in a way which reaches through. And I remember coming back on the plane from Auschwitz with some of the organizers, and they were showing me some materials they'd been given to the school children.
Yeah.
And they were both so well written, put together. I mean, they talked, for example, about the 8 steps to genocide and took them through that and how it could start. Step 1 was bullying in the playground, not treating other people with the respect and dignity they deserved. And it took you through the steps. It was frightening to see how, if you dehumanize anybody, if you ostracize and isolate individuals, how suddenly that hatred can build up. And obviously, fortunately, very rarely gets to the situation of a genocide, but the danger is it can. And therefore, if we dedicating ourselves to tackling this and never letting it happen again, we need to understand how the insights that the Holocaust Education Trust were sharing. And they did it both in an analytical way that I've described, but they also did it in an emotional way, using testaments. And when we had the debate in Parliament about this, I spoke actually just by reading a letter from that booklet that I got on that trip, because it's always touched me, and it almost brings me to tears just thinking about it, because it talks about a letter that a mother gave to her baby and put in the sewed into the lining of the baby's coat.
Yeah,
she gave the baby to someone who's going to help the baby be taken away and be saved, as she and her husband were taken to the concentration camps. And it talks about the life that wasn't going to happen. And as a parent, you read that pain.
Yeah. And
it can't do anything but touch you.
Yeah.
And it speaks about the humanity that is in all of us. And when the Holocaust Education Trust puts those things together, the intellectual things and the emotional things, it is so powerful, and you will never forget it. And that's why they need support. They haven't paid me to come and support them here today, just so you know. They are just amazing, absolutely amazing. And if we're going to teach our children and future generations, wherever people live in the world, they are the experts. They've got some amazing material.
So let them lead and continue to politically support their work. I mean, very, very touching. And many of us who have been privileged enough to be on trips like that and had close involvement with HET will echo exactly the things that you've said. Evolving it to the modern day, because this links very much in, and this is something that the Board of Deputies are, and LDFI, in fact, are working very hard on. I mean, the board essentially believes that there are 3 key things needed as part of the online harms legislation, which is the modern day vehicle. When Mosley was going around with his black shirts in the East End marching, the modern day Mosley and his acolytes now exist online in trolls and other forms. And there's always this tension for Lib Dems between freedom of speech, freedom of expression, but then how do we reconcile that with some degree of regulation of online activities? And certainly from the board's perspective, it believes that three of the key things that are needed as part of the online harms legislation in order to effectively safeguard are, first of all, ensuring that any regulator appointed to oversee social media companies adopts the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism and uses that as the standard by which it judges as to whether companies are discharging their obligations. So that's the first thing, the regulator using IHRA. Secondly, to ensure social media companies appoint a UK moderating team to moderate UK users, in the belief that in-country teams will be more likely to have political, cultural and linguistic context for cases. And thirdly, that the German model of heavy fines for social media companies for failure to comply with the legislation is adopted here well. So regulator that has the regulator uses IHRA as its definition and benchmark, social media companies using a UK moderating team, and possibly adopting the German model of heavy fines for the companies. What are your views on that, and where do you think we as a party can and should be pushing the government and leading the debate in this area?
Well, Gavin, you're absolutely right to raise this. There's no question there's far too much hate speech online that just goes without attention, and that obviously includes anti-Semitism. Yeah. And I think our approach, not dissimilar to the sorts of things you talked about, but let me just take you through.
Sure.
Because obviously there's the online harms legislation being put before Parliament. We've been discussed in Parliament. Hopefully will go through in some form. So it's a very live debate. We first start by let's enforce existing laws. Can do that now. Yeah. There's already far too much illegal content out there, illegal activity on social media that includes abuse, includes hate crimes, includes fraud, and it just goes unpoliced. And we've got the laws, they're just not being enforced. And so that will require more officers, more resources, more training for police and prosecutors. I know these are difficult times, but if we're going to tackle this, we've got to put our money where our mouth is. So that's the first thing. I think the second thing on social media companies, I couldn't agree more. They should uphold a duty of care to their users, especially children. But I'm afraid far too often they haven't. And Parliament and government have a vital role to play in clearly defining those duties. You just can't leave it to these big private firms, no. Facebook and Twitter. And we've got to be clear what are the acceptable bounds of free speech. We've had this debate before, we can do it, but we need to regulate. There's no doubt about that. We need some strong regulation and bring that up to date with the online social media we see. And so we have actually long argued that online harm legislation must include clear definitions. Yeah. The government's taken quite a vague approach. And if you're taking clear definitions to make sure people know what is acceptable and isn't acceptable, where they'll be prosecuted, where they won't be, it makes sense for the IHRA definition to be part of that. And
of course, the Tory government and the Lib Dem, we've all adopted that, so it's not a controversial issue.
It absolutely shouldn't be. But when we talk about on harm legislation, I hope therefore it can be easily adopted. So I think there's a huge amount of overlap in our views, and I haven't myself studied the German model. I'm very happy that we look into that and take that into account. There has to be teeth, right? I mean, these big tech giants won't come to book unless we have some teeth. Yeah, and that's interesting. And obviously, from our perspective, it's not something that's sort of leveraged per se, but the fact that Nick Clegg sits at where he does in Facebook probably does enable us to have to an extent some degree of communication that others maybe don't have. And it's about using those sensitively but appropriately. If Nick's prepared to engage on these issues, you'd obviously be the ideal person to advocate an approach that brings the tech companies in line and on side. We want to do it with them rather than begin them. I'm very happy to help a conversation with Nick. We've just exchanged texts over the leadership so far, but I'm very happy to be involved in that conversation and try to make sure that he does help.
Fantastic. It's in there. I think it's in their interest. Obviously, they have Richard Allen in there as well, who's a former, who was the predecessor to Nick in his seat. Fantastic. Just to drawing the anti-Semitism sort of online hatred thing to a close with a sort of final question, which has come up in the chat and the questions, and all the questions we're asking you today have been previously submitted. So this is a very effective forum for us. But just going back to something you touched on before, because in your answers to LDFI, you said that Labour had lost the trust of the Jewish community in failing to deal with the vast amount of complaints on anti-Semitism, and that you would never accept it staining us in the same way. And I think your words were tested in the recent mayoral selection process, as you alluded to. The question's been asked by many people ahead of this webinar about how did a candidate with such views, recorded on video and easily discoverable online, actually make it that far in the process. And I just wanted to give you an opportunity to just respond to that, because whilst what you did in being decisive in obviously suspending the individual in question, there is a bigger question actually that comes out, which is how does something like that happen in a mainstream political party?
Gavin, can I absolutely assure you and everyone else, that is the question that I was asking. And shall I say, I wasn't asking it quite as politely as I normally do. I was furious. And I am determined we don't make that mistake again. Now, I'm not directly in control. That's not the leader's job description, but working with Mark Pack as president and Mike Dixon as chief executive of the party, we're going to sort this. And we've got a lot of candidates that you have to vet over the period of time, and you can't have candidates bringing you into disrepute. We've got to sort that out, and it should never have got that far. And you know what? It's actually worse. I mean, people on this call may know this particular individual had said two other things unrelated to anti-Semitism as it happened, which also should have been found by the vetting process, because to my mind, they would have raised serious questions about whether she should be even considered to be a candidate. And the vetting process, therefore, made mistakes on three separate and different issues. So the vetting process was completely flawed, at least in this case. I don't know if it's had problems before. So let be no one in doubt we are raising those questions, because I cannot allow that to happen again. I think my voice, let me put it like this. I think people in Liberal Democrat HQ know my feelings about this.
That's reassuring, and we all look forward to the fallout from that, but respecting the fact that there is an internal process that needs to be undertaken. But unlike the Labour Party, I suppose we've taken decisive action up front in order to correct the mistakes of how we ended up there. So
can I say we did it within hours? I mean, there was talk about, well, people, it's a Sunday, can it not wait till Monday? No.
Yeah.
If we're going to well, hopefully we've got the trust, but keep the trust and reassure people, we've got to act as quickly as possible. And that, by the way, I mean, it's not necessarily for people on this call, but internally, we've got to give ourselves the ability to act quickly.
Yeah.
Sometimes that, can't get hold of someone who's in charge and so on and so on. And that prevents what ought to be obvious actions that are completely reasonable being taken at the speed they need to be. So there's I'm probably going out with what I need to talk about, but we are looking at doing a proper post-mortem on what went wrong.
What I can say, and Marie mentioned it in her opening remarks, is that on behalf of the Lib Dem Friends of Israel and on behalf of all right-minded Lib Dems, and I was inundated as the chair of LDFI, and I know Lord Palmer, who we'll be hearing from towards the end, was also inundated. The gratitude and the leadership that you took towards you and the leadership you showed in that. And similarly, actually, to Tim Farron, Tim acted very, very swiftly in previous examples. I think we've got a good track record as a party of acting decisively. That doesn't mean, however, we take the fact that these things happen lightly, and we need to understand that. Moving then on, conscious of time, and we've had lots of questions in. Moving on to the sort of Middle East as a sort of second strand of LDFI's perspective, but also of interest to many of the deputies that sit on the board. I want to touch on a couple of things with you, Ed. One of them is a hobby horse of mine. I mean, British Jews are strongly attached to Israel. 93% of British Jewry say Israel forms some part of their Jewish identity. In response to our question on Zionism during the Lib Dem leadership contest, you said that you absolutely agree with the existence of the state of Israel and its right to self-determination, and that you would agree that any country that doesn't recognize Israel to do so. However, you went on to say that you've been in politics too long to know that labels like being a Zionist are too open to misinterpretation, especially given the different schools of thought within Zionism. And one needs to be careful when specifically defining what that means. Why do you think that is? And I mean, this is a personal opinion of mine. The core view of Zionism is a belief in a nation state for the Jewish people. That doesn't mean to the exclusion of all others. It just means that the Jews have a physical home, and it doesn't mean anything more than that. I always liken it actually to when through the 70s and 80s, when the far right hijacked the Union Jack flag. And actually, Tony Blair, for all of his own sins, did a great job of bringing the Union Jack back into the ownership of the mainstream, called Britannia, and it's stayed there. So I see Zionism in not a dissimilar way. It's been hijacked by the far left and far right, and actually it's just a fundamental belief in a nation state for the Jewish people. But I get why you didn't want to go down that track, but I'm interested in your view on...
See, you and I, Gavin, can agree what we mean by Zionism, and both say, yeah, we agree with that. That's easy. But as you've just said, there are others who've tried to distort the meaning of that word. And in politics, that is part of a problem in our dialogue. And I fear it's getting worse, not better. People distort things, and whether it's social media, whether it's the times we live in. I don't know about you and the board, but one's always trying to make sure that people actually understand what we're trying to say and aren't able to distort it and aren't able to misrepresent us. Because you can bet there's someone out there who's trying to do that.
Yeah.
The Jewish community is misrepresented all the time, intentionally by many people, sometimes unintentionally. And that is why I think as we have a mature and grown-up conversation, we need to make sure we use the vocabulary that is as supportive and unifying as possible, where the enemies of our enemies don't allow either divisions between us or to misrepresent what we are trying to do. Because I don't know quite what motivates these people, but it's not pleasant. And people who sow divisions are people who we are both against, right? And we need to not play their game. I guess that's what I'm saying. Sometimes I see, culture wars and people desperate to try to divide people up and sow divisions, and we've got to be against that. Sometimes they're difficult issues, right? Which it's not easy to square. I mean, we've lived through Brexit. It's difficult to sort of bring people together. The country was divided, and we took a very clear view.
Sure.
And we lost that argument. You don't change your values, but I can do the.
So it's an ongoing. You're saying it's an ongoing fight to ensure that definitions and alignment are understood, and it makes it more mainstream. So then, just going straight into the Middle East, and I'm conscious that we want to cover off Israel and issues related. I mean, Israel's recently signed historic agreements normalizing relations with the UAE and the Kingdom of Bahrain, with the United States stating there are more to come. Do you welcome these moves? And do you believe that times are changing in the Middle East with cooperation and ending hostility being the way forward? And I just as an adjunct to that, I've always felt that whilst we wouldn't ever vote for Trump as Lib Dems, that does he have the ability, as is maybe being shown, to try and bring some of these parties together in a way that other presidents in the US have frankly failed over the last 20 years. Interested in your view on the wider question of our times are changing, and is this cooperation going to see an end to hostility?
Well, in wanting people to sign those sorts of agreements, putting age-long hostilities behind them, in line with what I said about the importance of everyone recognizing the right of Israel to exist.
Yeah.
That has to be welcomed. But, and there is a but, I'm afraid, I think the way that Trump has engaged in this, there might be bits of it that we can welcome, but I'm afraid there's quite a bit of it that we can't. And I've got to be frank with you, what they've said with respect to the Palestinian territories in the West Bank, I don't agree with what Trump said on that, or indeed what Prime Minister Netanyahu said on that.
Don't worry, Ed, neither do we, and we've said that publicly.
Yeah, no, I didn't think it would be controversial with you, Gavin, but you know, this is one of the challenges. I have occasionally had reason to criticize the government of Israel, but that is never a criticism of Israelis, and certainly not of the Jewish people. But you know, like, I criticize the UK government, right, a lot, and I criticize other governments, but that doesn't make me anti-British. And I just feel on the annexation point, this really sends exactly the wrong signal. And I just don't trust Trump to be the sort of neutral arbiter that we need. I don't see him bringing. I mean, it's good that they got one or two of these countries to come together. That is important. I don't decry that, but we've got to get the Palestinian people together. Now, clearly, there's been divisions within the Palestinian people.
Yes,
we know that.
Yes.
And it's been difficult for the Israeli government, let's be fair, to know exactly who is the negotiating partner. I would like to see Netanyahu facilitating that, so we could have those peace discussions again. And I don't think he always has done, if I'm frank with you.
Yeah, I think that's fair. And I think on the point of annexation, I mean, LDFI put out a statement decrying it and not supporting it. Close watchers of Israeli politics would tell you that was an election stunt, which that happens when extreme statements are made, and it's a strange neighborhood, the Middle East, to have to make such statements that have such big geopolitical impacts in order to win an election. But that's as it is. That's their system, not ours. I suppose you mentioned Trump and the wider peace plan. You've said that Iran, just moving on to Iran, is governed by a brutal regime, which has been openly hostile to the West, and it's repeatedly called for the destruction of Israel and Jews around the world. However, you said you don't support Trump's aggressive approach to Iran. So, just interested for the listeners, where do we as a party sit on the conflict between the West and Iran? Critical geopolitical issue, and probably underlined why Bahrain and UAE, probably supported by Saudi Arabia, have been allowed to make peace with Israel. Saudi Arabia is obviously the big fish in that pond. But where do we sit with the Iran-West issue? Because a lot of the terrorism that's coming out of the Middle East is sponsored by Iran, and that's where Israel is very much in its sort of most paranoid state, if you like. So, what's your view briefly on that?
Well, I'm very worried about Iran. Anyone who studied the politics, not just with Israel, frankly, but the whole of the Middle East and beyond, can see a regime which has fostered terrorism and is a real huge problem for peace and security. And the debate is the best way to contain Iran and to bring Iran in. When President Obama signed the agreement with Iran, where the UK was a co-signatory with others, we were very supportive of it. I was very pleasantly surprised. I know Trump and others criticized it, but those of you who'd watched Iran over the previous years to that peace agreement, I was alarmed at the pace at which they were moving towards having a nuclear weapon.
So where now?
Well, talk to me after November the 4th.
Yes.
Because they're very, very different scenarios. I'll be absolutely frank with you. I would like Joe Biden to win. Frankly, not just to win, but to win massively. And so that if it is possible to rescue the Iran Accord, that is done. and that we try to contain Iran and bring Iran in. Now, the reality is there's different stages of that, isn't there? There's preventing nuclearization, and then there's gradually changing their whole attitude, which will take a lot longer. Here's the thing, and you may think this is a bit weird for me to say, but I do think quite a lot about geopolitics as it happens. And I think the campaigns that I've been involved in, the work that I've done actually on renewable energy, is actually relevant to this debate. Because oil, including Iran's own oil, which gives it the money, if we can be a world less dependent on oil and give less money to oil states, then I think this is a good thing for peace. If less money is going to the pockets of the Ayatollah, the pockets of Putin, the pockets of the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, I think this is a good thing. If people can be more independent with solar and wind, which they don't have to import, it's given by God, then not only is that fantastic for our climate, but it can tackle poverty and it can add to security. And while that you might think that's weird, me bringing that in.
No, a lot of this tech comes from Israel as well. I mean, a lot of the tech innovations. I mean, we haven't touched on the wider. There's not enough time, but you're right. It's that economic ripple effect through geopolitics and moving off dependency of oil, which takes the power away from the brokers of some of this discourse. So I can see the link, absolutely. Not many people have made that link, but that's a powerful. Before I hand over to Lord Palmer, I'm just wanted to thank you on a personal level. Tonight is Kol Nidra, which is the beginning of Yom Kippur, when we all the Jewish members of the party will be atoning. I'll be atoning for not knocking on as many doors as I perhaps could have in 2019, but I strive to do better next year. We're very grateful for your time, Ed. I'm going to pass over to Lord Palmer to make a vote of thanks. But as LDFI and on behalf of the board as well, we very much look forward to continuing to work with you and your team. You've got an excellent team, and this is the start of something exciting, and we're very enthused and encouraged by your leadership, and whatever we can do as a community, both politically, I'm sure we will be there to support you. But I'm going to hand over now to your friend of mine, Lord Monroe Palmer, to wind things up. Thank you, Ed.
I like to be thought of as friends of everybody. I have the wonderful job, one, of thanking Ed for doing this. It's broken new ground for us, and I hope it will be something that we and others can do in the future. And it's my great pleasure to thank also Marie van der Zijl and all those of the Board of Deputies who've helped make this happen. And for Gavin for chairing it, backed up by LDFI's executive and its members. Not forgetting the Liberal Democrat conference team who've also made this happen. There's been a lot of comments in the chat column of this conference. Can I say that we will all take those comments into account? And the trouble with all these meetings, whether they're actual or virtual, is that many people want to raise things. There's never enough time for us to deal with them all, but they are noted. Some I agree with and some I don't agree with. That's because I'm a Liberal Democrat. The point I would add is that the points we've covered have been to do with the Jewish community in the UK, and that also includes attitudes to Israel and the Palestinians. But the important thing, as I think Ed has said and the party has said, that there are interesting things that the party is saying and which are of concern to the Jewish community as well. They include what's happening on the pandemic, what's happening to businesses and happening to the economy, what's happening to the charity sector, what's happening on education. And all these matters are matters which concern everybody, including the Jewish community. But what we've concentrated on today, and we've made Ed concentrate on today, is those specific matters which are not covered by the wider consideration. So once again, thank you very much to the Board of Deputies and the Liberal Democrat Friends of Israel and the party conference, and particularly Ed Davey for facilitating this. We congratulate you on being the new leader of the party. Probably the last person to say that to you publicly. We congratulate you, and we wish this conference a great success. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much indeed, Monroe. Thanks, Gavin. Thanks everyone for watching. And I really look forward to our future conversations.